second session of the Fireside conversation about trauma, resiliency, hope, hosted by the Navajo Nation's first and second lady. Hello to everyone tuning in again this afternoon by Zoom and or by radio. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn about trauma, resiliency, and hope. We have a lot of information to cover over 4 90-minute sessions, so please continue to join us. If you can't make it or miss any sessions, all of these sessions are being recorded for future viewing. I also want to let you know that all these sessions will be done in English because of our presenters joining us from other tribal nations. So please help us out and translate for our elders and other individuals who need Denepazad. We appreciate your understanding. I see that all of our guests and special presenters have joined us. Welcome, and it's good to see you again this morning or this afternoon. To get us started in a good way, we have asked a special guest to join us this afternoon. Please welcome Miss Navajo Nation, Niagara Rockbridge. She will start us off by saying a blessing and getting us grounded in a good way. Miss Navajo Nation. Did we lose her?
Perhaps she's on mute.
Well, while we await for Miss Navajo Nation to rejoin us, I will go ahead and welcome everyone. I will introduce myself. Ya'ate Melissa Clyde Yanishya, Twabaha Nishle, Bitani Bashishteen, Kia Ani A Dashache, Zitlatni A Dashanele, Tohachi Dantnasha, Diastan Nishle. I am joining you today from Denver, Colorado. I work for Casey Family Programs, an operating foundation. I work with Casey's Indian Child Welfare Programs based in Denver. Our headquarters is in Seattle, Washington. Casey Family Programs is the nation's largest operating foundation focused on safely reducing the need for foster care in the United States. Our mission is to provide and improve and ultimately prevent the need for foster care. We are committed to building communities of hope, a nationwide effort to prevent the need for foster care by supporting families in raising safe and healthy children. Casey Family Programs has a special collaborative agreement and partnership with the Navajo Nation to work together to build communities of hope and to uplift the resiliency of the Navajo people to care and love their children in a healthy and safe way. Over several years, we have worked together to develop strategies to safely reduce the need for foster care. Embedded in every cornerstone of our work together is creating safe and healthy spaces to learn about trauma, resiliency, and hope. In order to do this, we are able to bring other organizations and entities that understand tribal nations and tribal sovereignty. Casey is happy to have the National Native Children's Trauma Center at the University of Montana to join us as our presenters for this series. Today, we will learn about the impact of trauma within tribal families and communities with our presenters today. They will introduce themselves shortly. Again, I want to check in to see if our special guest, Miss Navajo Nation, has joined us.
She did lose connection shortly, Melissa.
Okay, so Sonia, do you want to just go ahead and get us started and get us grounded in a good way?
Good afternoon, everyone. Ya'ate She'e Sonia Begay Yanishya, Twitch Edi Nishla, Hanagatni Bashishtin, Kiani Dashachedok, Azatlana Dashanella. She'e Nikinat Ani and Lajit Dasadahiki, Jonathan Nez, Ado, Kego Net Dasadahiki, Myron Lizer, Ahanago Banashnish. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sonia Begay, and I'm an executive staff assistant with the Navajo Nation Office of the President and Vice President, as well as the Navajo Nation Office of the First Lady and Second Lady. And I welcome you all today to our second session for our trauma series. I actually see Miss Navajo is online right now.
Oh, excellent.
Miss Navajo, are you here?
Yes, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. I apologize for the tardiness here. I am actually traveling back from Navajo from a previous engagement. So my apologies, but I am here with you all today to provide the prayer as was requested. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Ya Niagara Rock Bridge and Kia ani nishlidosh so hobashish china kedina edash chedo to hanedashnale. Shayna kedemil daba anna din la ihahagi do na kedemil daba anna din na ki hahagi the nebaj eketnishle. So hello everyone, my name is Niagara Rockbridge. I am the current reigning Miss Navajo Nation for 2021 to 2022. It is an honor to be here with you all today and to be asked to provide this blessing for the event that is taking place today in regards to healing for our people. And I feel like it is a very important topic that is being light shed on to. And so with that, thank you to Casey family and then also Office of the First and Second Lady of the Navajo Nation, and then the individuals who have also helped put this event together. I graciously shake you warmly by the hand, and with all the much gratitude that I have, thank you for putting this on for our people. So with that, I'll go ahead and provide my prayer, and it will be done in Navajo. And so if you are wearing a hat or so on and so forth, if you could please remove that at this time as we are going to pray. Koroho jodo le shamana hasan shkhat yadelhe. Hayot kat lo hadet ij na hot suich ka halgel nilchidin den e. Dansh ak e khay nilchidin den e. Chehest el tish chehest e wan. Yolka isa masana deheshma. Kon e ya DJ kon ihitsui nihiyaje nihinala nitlo akot au eya beniya ko atlasitli ako najana ko di akot au hashin sogo eya nihin dan lenigi inta en nihijay lenigi najana ko benihit khaya da hot etole bedzil ko nasko na ne khatole hashin sogo di da tsena kina khajin akot au hat ishin ko nihit khapaho na egi nihit khahono ado inta eya hashin sogo kodo nihidinne dan lenegi bejeto ben sekes dastil ako ne tienden edan o lenegi kodo eya nihin hasla ko ben nachen eya ha na jana ko nihit khaya da hot etole benihit zilo nasko nes ne nijen nane katole na jana ko eya na jana ko nihit zilo na jana ko eya ha ko nihit na hasan ba ka get nane katole nane tetole hik e holo kodo inta eya ahya nihit dini dole kondi in den eda no lini di kot out eya ni ka ndol ya do kot out eya ahya dini dole do nasko eya ha benach be nit e dole akot akon sogo shin kodo ashe hashin sogo kodo nihit so des zendo eya kodo nihit den eda lini gi na jana ko eya Nihie nado ha na jana ko ne nasko ne nijit nihi to de zin no do nihi yi nadi yi do le benachin eya na jana ko kon nane kato le a kon sogo shin kodo to de zin be ha si do le do ha shin sogo kodo do a kot au ishla gi do ha shin sogo do na jana ko kot au ha si gi a nihi na hol ni kon di in den eda no linin gi hash eda do li slash on the hey kon di in den eda no linin gi a ko e ya ha na jana ko shin So anagibik ehojon nane katole tadadin atkimbik ekonane katole. Nihitsijit nahojo dole ni kede nahojo dole ni yagi nahojo dole ni igi nahojo dole. Nihit nagit alton nihit ehojon dole nihit zalat kahojon. Esa anagibik ehojon daniglin kohne kaidole. Hojon hastli, hojon hastli, hojon hastli, hojon hastli. With that, I have asked the holy people to bring healing to our people, to make us strong and heal our minds, our spirits, and our souls. And so I hope that this prayer resonates with you and instills a sense of strength. And I hope that you feel my gratitude with this for the information that you are providing today to the individuals who will be watching this presentation, who will be tuning in at a later time. So thank you all for inviting me here today, to Sonia, to First Lady, and to Second Lady, and to our Vice President and our President of the Navajo Nation. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, Miss Navajo, nice to see you again. The last time I'd seen you, we did some work together at the United Nations in New York City. So it's nice to see you and blessing us with your grace and your leadership. So thank you for joining us this afternoon and providing the space for healing and gratitude. So thank you so much. We are going to go ahead and get us started, and we welcome you to stay with us too, Miss Navajo Nation, throughout this conversation today. I'm really grateful that Casey Family Programs is able to bring together all of these wonderful individuals at Navajo Nation and our partners at the University of Montana through the National Native Children's Trauma Center. And so I'm going to actually turn it over to you, Dr. Marilyn Zimmerman, to go ahead and get us started with your team. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to start with introductions for our team. So I'll have Kimmy Wind Hummingbird go first. This isn't our whole team, this is just his presenting today.
It's Jay, Stongo, Kimmy Wind Hummingbird, Jahajikados. My name is Kimmy Wind Hummingbird. I am Muskogee, and I'm joining you today from my reservation in Oklahoma. And prior to joining the NNCTC team about 8 months ago, I worked in Indian child welfare for 22 years. So all I know is working within tribal communities and helping families. And thank you for allowing us to be here today.
Thanks, Kimmy. Laura?
Hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Laura Gay. I'm a Training and Technical Assistance Manager for the National Native Children's Trauma Center. My background's in child welfare, and the work I've been doing with the Trauma Center for the last 4 years has really been about supporting tribes who are out there doing the work to become trauma informed, to be resilience focused, and to ground everything they do in their culture and within the local community. So thank you for having me here today, and looking forward to our time together.
Thanks, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Marilyn Brewer Zimmerman. I'm a citizen of the Nakona and Dakota Nations. I am a member of the Cree speaker band of the Nakota people and the Hunkpapa Dakota people. I'm also a descendant of, have Ojibwe descendancy and Nawa descendancy, and I'm really pleased to be with you. I'm the founding director of the Trauma Center way back in 2007, but I currently serve as the Senior Director of Policy and Programs at the Trauma Center at the University of Montana. And we are so grateful and so humbled to be here with you all today at the invitation of Casey Family Programs and the First Lady and the Second Lady's Office for Navajo Nation. So let's get started. Comments from the office, Sonia.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. Again, my name is Sonia Begay, and I'm the Executive Staff Assistant for the Navajo Nation Office of the First Lady and Second Lady. As we move into the new year 2022, which is just upon us in the next couple of days, we can't help but reflect on this past year. And so as the new year approaches, I encourage you all to reflect on how far you've come, as well as how far your families have come. resilience. President Nez always talks about resilience, and we as a Navajo people coming this far, these past 21 months, that's really a true testament of resilience. And so with the Office of the First Lady and Second Lady, we have a strong focus on building and fostering healthy families. And this includes really focusing on the home environment, goes into parenting, marriages, lifelong education, faith and cultural well-being, and holistic healing and restoration of individual and family units. So we welcome you to the second installment of Fireside Conversations on Trauma, Resiliency, and Hope. And this was made possible through a partnership with Casey Family Program, as well as the National Native Children's Trauma Center, which is out of the University of Montana. And so through our work with Casey Family Programs, we were able to partner with Dr. Marilyn Zimmerman and her staff. And it is our goal to provide educational and informative information on trauma, the different types, keywords, definitions, and available resources. Fireside Conversations on Trauma, Resiliency, and Hope is a 4-part series. Our first session was this past Tuesday. Today will be session number 2. Session 3 and 4 will be in January 12th and 14th. So we encourage you all to come back and join us. Listen in to our sessions. If you're unable to tune in live, all our webinars are recorded and archived on the Navajo Nation OPVP communications channel. And you can access all of those recordings there. In addition, we have Across Nations Broadcasting, who is also live streaming this series for those without access to the internet and in rural areas. You can listen live on KHAC 880 AM and 96.7 FM in the Window-Rock area, and KTBA 760 AM and 96.3 FM in Tuba City. Office of the First Lady and Second Lady also shares information, resources, and community events through our mobile app. You may now download from the Apple Store or Google Play Store. And we encourage you to download it to stay connected with our office. We have the QR code up right now. You may hold your phone camera to the QR code and it'll automatically scan it. And it'll take you to the page where you are able to download. And so we hope that you can utilize and incorporate the information you receive through these sessions, and that we hope it will allow you to begin the conversation in your homes as well. In closing, as winter is setting in upon us, we did get some snow here in the Window-Rock area and across the Navajo Nation. So I just want to remind you to please check on your elders. Bundle up and stay warm, please. If you must travel, do so during the day. Avoid traveling at night. And so stay warm, continue to wear your mask. And we thank you for being here today. Akaha.
Thank you, Sonia. So I think we'll just get started. We want to invite you to participate at any point. If you have a comment that you would like to make or a question that you'd like to ask, please type it into the chat. Laura and Kimmy are paying attention, and whenever they're presenting, it'll be me and one of them paying attention to the chat to make sure everyone has is able to have participate in this conversation. We start out, unfortunately, on some heavy news. Always when we start these presentations about trauma, it's critical for us to understand trauma, define it. What is it? So, what are the impacts of it? What are the short-term, long-term impacts when we are exposed to chronic trauma? And we're also going to take a look at the impact of the pandemic, COVID-19, on our well-being as Native people. So we, again, invite you to join the conversation at any point. Drop something in chat. It doesn't have to be a question. It can be a comment. Right, let's get started. So always we want to warn everyone that some of the conversations we have or the examples that we use shouldn't be triggering. It should not trigger any sort of memory you might have of a traumatic event that you may have experienced in your lifetime. We know that everyone, right, has a lot of trauma simply because that's life. Bad things happen to good people. So we just want you to recognize if you need some extra help, that you can reach out to a supportive person in your life. It could be a grandma, it could be your best friend, or it could be a mental health professional. We always want to encourage tribal people to participate in or lean into their traditional cultural and spiritual ways of healing, those practices that have served us so well for tens of thousands of years, no matter what sort of challenges we faced as people. Also want to bring to your attention the crisis text line. I always like to talk about the grad students who I can't ever get a hold of unless I text them, right? I can send a lot of emails and no one answers. I can call their telephones and no one answers. I send a text and I have a response in 5 minutes. This is a particularly useful text line or crisis line because of texting. It's so anonymous, right? No one even has to see the name on the phone call, right? And it seems to be that the younger generations really appreciate the crisis text line. Now, I want to make note that the crisis text line is not necessarily for domestic violence in particular, or for suicidal thoughts. This is any kind of crisis. So I always like to give an example of a rural Assiniboine or Nakona adolescent in rural Montana who might be struggling with sexual and gender identity, and they don't feel like they have anybody to talk to. They can reach out to this crisis text line and have this conversation. Or it can be someone who has food insecurity in a particular urban setting, and the crisis text line can help them find resources. You can call it or text if you're having suicidal thoughts also, but just want to make sure that you all know that the National Suicide Prevention Hotline is a phone line that's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as is the crisis text line. And so please avail yourself of those resources if you find them necessary. Yesterday we had Dr. Michelle Branzer from Navajo talk about and go through this beautiful, really she says it's not quite comprehensive. It seems comprehensive to me. This resource that in the chat, you can find the links to either the PDF or the website where you can find this resource. And it's a resource that covers some of these national emergency hotlines, but it's local resources. It's local Navajo Nation resources for law enforcement, for mental health, for emergencies, for housing, for counsel, and it just has so many resources. And it's really easy to manage and understand. It has a lot of pages, but it's well worth downloading if you're able to, or it's well worth printing off if you're able to. It's just wonderful. There are a few updates that have to be made, as in when people retire or move to a different position, but on the whole, it's all up to date. So we really encourage you to access this resource and use some of the local, and be able to access some of your local resources. National crisis text lines and hotlines are fine, but nobody knows us like our own, right? Okay. So as I said earlier, trauma is pretty common. And why do we need to learn about it? Because it is so common. I want to make sure that everyone is aware of, oops, getting too excited here. Everyone is aware of a video that the First Lady and the Second Lady put on their app and on their YouTube channel that talks about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it's about a 28-minute video that does the best explanation of what ACEs are and the physical and emotional and psychological outcomes from ACEs that we know of. So when you have something that good, why recreate the wheel? So we always ask people to pay attention to that. It's a great 28-minute video. It's engaging, and it's very easily understood. So from this particular study, we found out that the average American will have at least 4 traumatic events in their lifetimes. And this particular study studied household or family traumatic events. So living in a household with a lot of chaos, living with an impaired caregiver, either because they were depressed or they had substance use disorder, living with being neglected, experiencing physical or sexual abuse. These all counted as 1 in your ACE score until you got up to 10 ACE score of 10. What it did not cover, though, was the ways that we experience racism or bigotry, or the location, right? We don't, some of us, I know Navajo, like my reservation, we're very isolated. There's very isolated communities. Not everybody on my reservation has access to Indian Health Service unless, you know, a CHR or their relatives bring them themselves. So it's really important to understand that that is stressful too. It didn't take into account poverty, which is stressful also. I always like to say that poverty isn't a sin or a crime, but what it can do is really impact the caregiver in a family. And so while their financial resources have been sort of depleted and they struggle a lot and worry a lot, their emotional and psychological and often their spiritual resources become drained by that struggle. So ACEs did not take those into account. So I'd like to just have you all thinking about what kind of challenges you may have faced or your relatives may have faced or are facing today. Moving on. So we also know that people who have chronic trauma histories, whether it's physical abuse or sexual abuse, living in chaotic households, or not having a supportive caregiver, caring, loving, nurturing caregiver before adulthood, that most often we try to cope with our feelings and cope with our circumstances by abusing substances, and often we become addicted to those substances. So trauma, the gateway drug is not necessarily, you know, cigarettes or marijuana. The gateway drug is trauma, because people are looking for ways to cope and ways to feel like they're whole or to feel safe and secure, both physically and emotionally. We know that tribal communities and programs have unique opportunities to provide these community-wide efforts. Case in point is the way Navajo Nation itself and many other tribes around the nation really responded to COVID-19 and the lockdowns that you made sure to keep your people safe. You did better than most states and counties in North America. So again, that unique opportunity of working and living beside your relatives and wanting to be a support to each other. And always thinking about what can bring healing or change to your families and to your communities. All right, I'm going to pass it now for some definitions to Laura.
Thanks, Marilyn. So in that first session that we had, Marilyn spent some time talking and defining trauma for you all, and focus specifically on historical and intergenerational trauma. And today we're going to talk about trauma a little bit more broadly as we get going here, to talk about what goes on within the body and our minds and our spirits when we're experiencing trauma and after a traumatic event or a series of circumstances have happened to us. So here's a definition of trauma. It's really a 3-part equation, right? So there is an event or set of circumstances that occurs, right? And sometimes these events are isolated. This might be a house fire. It could be a car accident. But in general, they're not predictable. They're one-off things that aren't likely to occur again, that can be experienced as trauma. And then there are events that happen in either a random or predictable way, but occur over time, right? They're chronic, that a person experiencing these traumas can almost come to expect them, right? We see that a lot in homes where kids experience maltreatment. When we think about types of trauma, one of the most impactful forms of trauma is what we call chronic or complex trauma. And that is when a child experiences traumas at the hands of their caregivers, right? So trying to reconcile the harm and pain that might be coming from that person who's in place to love and nurture you. So an event has to take place. That might look like child maltreatment. It could look like the isolated incident of a car accident or a fire. It may look like living with housing or food insecurity, but there's an event that takes place. But the next column here, experience, we all make meaning of the events that happen in our lives very differently. And that's based off what makes us vulnerable and what protects us from some of the harm of these events, right? So some of the things that make us vulnerable are our age. The younger we are, the less able we are to protect ourselves and make a meaning of our events using kind of our cognitive functioning to understand why someone might do that to us, to think beyond ourselves and question, like, I wonder why they're behaving in that way, right? Our ability to make meaning is just harder the younger we are. And we're more at risk to be truly physically harmed by violence or things like that, or not being fed properly. Other things that make us vulnerable are a lack of social supports, right? So not having caregivers or relatives or a community that's able to come around and support after an event has happened. Similar things that another particular vulnerability can be the experience of past trauma. So a person who's experienced trauma after trauma is more at risk to experience effects from those than the person who may be experiencing a trauma for the first time at, say, the age of 16 or 25. And similarly, protective factors are all around us, right? So when we have caregivers who are stable, trustworthy, and provide unconditional support, we are buffered from the negative consequences often of those events that we go through. When we have communities that offer us connection and resources to heal, from things we've experienced or set of circumstances we might be in, we are more buffered from having some negative effects of trauma. And the other bit I wanted to say is that the stronger our sense of identity is, the more protected we are. So the more we are connected to culture, the more we are connected to traditional teachings and values, our language, the land, the better able, the firmer people feel they know who they are and why they're here and the purpose of it all, right? That protects us when we feel confident and sturdy in those things. So events happen, we make meaning of them in various ways, but oftentimes how we calculate those first two columns influences the effects that we experience. And we see effects of trauma, the way we interact with the world, people, the relationships we have, the behaviors we might engage in. Those effects often fall into these categories. And Marilyn's going to spend some time this afternoon breaking those down more specifically of what they look like. But we see people have physical consequences to some of the experiences they've had, like having a hard time sleeping, like eating too much or too little, repressed immune systems, right? Getting sick constantly. We see our social interactions impacted. We might isolate. We might choose to be around people who are struggling in similar ways. And that can be for good or for bad, right? If they're enabling of some of the things we're using to cope that aren't healthy for us. And of course, the list goes on here. And Marilyn will break those down a bit more. But the effects of what we experienced vary based on how we make meaning of those events. Next slide, Marilyn. Okay, so how can the circumstance we're in cause those effects, right? So how do we get from witnessing violence in our home? How do we get from experiencing housing instability to having the effects of extreme anxiety or not being able to sleep? What is the connection between what we go through and some of these undesirable effects that we often hear connected to trauma, right? And so that answer lies in what's going on in our bodies, as those events happen and then beyond that, right? So when a person is feeling threatened, right, a trauma is in front of them, there might be violence going on in the home, their bodies are preparing to protect themselves. So what happens in those moments is we dump a bunch of hormones, right? We dump cortisol, we dump adrenaline, and that tells us to get ready to fight, flight, or freeze, right? We are ready to react. We are ready to respond. Our body shuts down more non-essential functions like our digestive system, like our critical thinking skills, and it sends blood to like our hands and our feet. We are ready to react, right? We don't want to think about it too long. We got to react to protect ourselves. And so that's what the body's doing internally. And that's good when the threat is in front of you and you need to keep yourself safe. But what becomes problematic for people who experience trauma in an ongoing way is their bodies aren't ever able to fully come back to that calm baseline, right? Where they aren't experiencing that dump of cortisol and adrenaline, where they're able to use those higher order functioning skills like critical thinking. And in that calm place where we want to be is where we do our best learning, where we engage in relationships in a healthy way and can connect with other people and things around us. So when our body's doing all that, it's preparing us to fight, flight, or freeze. And some examples of what that looks like are on the next slide here, Marilyn.
I think, I hope it's okay. I want to tell the Nadine Burke story.
Yes, please.
So this body stress response system was created for our survival. So think back to we're walking upright or we're created in the garden, whatever, but this was in order to protect us, right? So if we're walking in the woods and we meet up with a bear, right? As Laura described, cortisol, adrenaline gets dumped into our system, and we have that instant fight, flight, or freeze response where we're either going to fight the bear, we're going to run from the bear, or we're going to freeze and hope the bear ignores us. And it's a really good response system. It keeps us alive. It's kept our species alive, right? But Nadine, Dr. Burke gives the example of, but what happens when the bear comes home every night? Right? It's not, we do have that fight, flight, or freeze, and we stay there and we stay in that high alert state simply because we're trying to survive, right? It's our survival instinct. So just think about all of the people in your life who had a bear living in their house or coming home at night.
Marilyn. So here's some examples of what those reactions look like, right? So that fight reaction could look like aggressive behavior, could look like being defiant, right? Screaming, yelling, arguing, talking back. And when we think about what when that's in front of us, it might be in front of us, but it's not about us. So when we think about what is the function of those behaviors, they have served to protect that person in the past. So if I get big, I know that because me getting big and getting in people's faces in the past has diffused some situation, right? Someone has backed down or left someone alone, and that has kept me and that loved one of mine safe. So we always want to be asking ourselves, how has this served to protect someone in their past, right? We often hear people fight response as hypervigilance. It's like being on the balls of your feet, ready to react, ready to respond at any moment. And that takes a lot of our energy, right? A lot of our soul to be ready to react at all times. The flight response, so this is when that really natural, quick response to calculate what we need to do to keep ourselves safe has said we're not big or strong enough to fight off this threat, but we might be fast enough to outrun it. So sometimes that looks like withdrawing, right? It might look like withdrawing from our friends, from our family, not engaging in the activities that we used to do on a regular basis, just in general, becoming disengaged. That freeze response for youth, so I'm going to go back, sorry, for the flight. Youth, it might look like running out of a classroom, right? It might look like running away from home. It might look like just being unwilling to talk or communicate about what's going on with them. And that freeze response is really our reaction when our brains calculate, our bodies react in a way that say, we're not big enough to fight this threat off. We're not fast enough to run from it. So the only thing I can do is disconnect from the reality in front of me. So the only thing I can do to not experience this as severe or intense as it is to just mentally check out, right? So we see that sometimes it's called disassociating, and there are varying degrees of it, right? So it might look like a kid you just can't, hello, are you listening, right? Like 3 claps if you can hear me, that sort of thing. But it is that numbness, it is that that just general disconnection people have when others are trying to engage them. They have gone to a different place so that they don't have to experience what's going on. And I also wanted to highlight, we're thinking about people who fall through the cracks, so to speak, right? When people are struggling and we miss it, there are often folks experiencing that stress response piece of freezing, right? They're generally more compliant. They probably even get decent grades and do pretty well in school, right? But that's not to say that what they have experienced or are currently experiencing isn't just as challenging for them as it is for those kids who might be throwing a desk or running out of class or getting in your face and yelling. So the next slide, what I wanted to mention is what becomes challenging is for people who've experienced trauma. When it happens, they are taking in all the information around them to understand so that they're ready to react next time even quicker and more efficiently to keep themselves safe. So we're taking in the 5 senses, right? What are those sounds I'm hearing? What are the tastes that I'm tasting? What are the smells? What can I see with my eyes? Categorizing that information as threats, and a lot of times emotional reactions. So if we notice fear on someone's face and a trauma is going on, we're going to start to recognize a fear facial reaction or a fear emotional response as threatening, right? So we calculate that information and categorize it in our brains as potentially dangerous, so prepare to react. And so for a person that's experienced multiple traumas, right, triggers or reminders of these events can be all around us. And when we smell that spaghetti, when we hear people yelling, we are right back in those moments where that really dangerous thing happened to us, as though it's happening right now. But the problem is it could just be a loud classroom. It could just be the TV turned on too loud with something going on that, a loud kind of violent scene or something. But in our bodies then prepare to fight, flight, or freeze. We have gone back to that actually truly dangerous moment for ourselves. And we are ready to fight the bear, run from the bear, or hunker down and hope that the bear doesn't see us, right? Disassociate from the reality that's around us. We often say that because triggers are everywhere and we're never going to know someone's whole total story, that we can unintentionally trigger people all the time, right? Sometimes it's described as like walking through a landmine and we don't know where they are. And what we can do to support people, right, is to know the most we can about their history so we can work to avoid some of those really obvious triggers, but that we can also be prepared to react when someone is triggered, to see it for what it is, right? That it might be in front of us, but it's not about us. So how do I regulate myself so that I'm calm, so that I'm able to help validate what they're going through, and that I'm able to model ways to get back to baseline, to get back to a place of calm versus this hyper alert stage and of ready to react and respond. And with that, I believe I turn it back over to Marilyn, who's going to talk about what happens when we exist in this kind of constant state of toxic stress, or this constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. It can begin to have impacts on development.
Thank you, Laura. So I just want, you're going to hear me several times. You've heard Laura say it. Just want to remind everyone that we always have to think about whether it's our client, our student, our grandma, our patient, no matter where we are in the world, that we have to ask ourselves when there's an unusual response, right? That's happening in front of you. What is the function of the behavior. And the function of the behavior is always to find psychological and physical safety, always. So that's, so just keep that in mind as we go through more information here. So body development can be more distressing for especially large transitions from childhood to adolescence and adolescence to adulthood. Trauma is a hormonal response in our guts. And of course, adolescence is all about hormones, and it can really impact adolescence. Our own bodies can serve as trauma reminders. I had a client once who had violent sexual assault when she was 12, and it was in the fall, and it was dark, and it was at a powwow, and the drums, so no one could hear her scream. But then fast forward, she'd done a lot of good work. She'd done a lot of good healing, so much healing that she rarely remembered or thought about at the event. But she's 35 now, and seeing me just to, because she was very aware of her need to heal along the way. She was walking at 35 years old. It got dark really soon. It was during that particular powwow weekend. She could hear the drums. She could smell burning leaves, and it was getting dark. And she really didn't make the connection. All of a sudden, she had a fear response, a fear reaction, where she started to breathe really, shallowly. She went from the sidewalk out, and she was 2 blocks from her house, out into the middle of the street and walked. And so she was healed enough to be able to say, what is happening? Why do I feel so afraid? And she suddenly realized, right, it was dark. She smelled leaves. She heard powwow drums. And it brought her body remembered before her mind did. So our body can serve as a trauma reminder. We always want to remind folks. I want to look at chat. Is there someone? Oh, okay. Thanks, Laura. Oops, wrong. I always try to hit going away. So remind ourselves that sometimes because our body reacts so strongly to a traumatic event, we can some maladaptive ways of coping can be not just about alcohol and substance use in order to feel better, but cutting, piercing, maladaptive eating, whether we're eating too much or not eating enough. And just again, a reminder that Laura brought up is that our immune system is really impacted by trauma. So as I think about my aging relatives, right, and losing family and relatives back home, so we shouldn't be dying of chronic diseases at 57 years old or 50 years old, right? Something's happening besides, just diabetes and the American diet. Our immune system has been compromised from childhood, and we can't fight off some of those diseases that we die from at alarming rates as Indigenous people. Want everyone to, because this is really critical. We want to understand the impact on social development so that we can be empathetic and understanding and supportive of some of our relatives who may not be able to engage socially the way we would. We can't say to another person, gosh, why don't you just get out there and, go to a feed, go to a public event. Maybe they can't, maybe they have been raised or they have experienced so many traumatic events that to make themselves feel safe, they withdraw or they isolate in their own households, right? Or if it's an adolescence, they don't eat lunch with anybody, or they don't join teams or after school projects and those kinds of things. There is a definitely persistent distrust and suspiciousness of others, and this can come out sideways, particularly in professional helping organizations, right? So you can have a client who is avoidant, right? Doesn't come to the appointments, doesn't make the appointments, or if they do, they're late, or they're standing in front of you yelling that they need help right now, right? So there's just this distrust of the system to meet their needs, to keep them safe, and to keep respond to what it is that they don't even know how to describe, that we'll talk about in a couple minutes. Many people have a continued expectation of maltreatment. If I was treated bad as an adolescent, or I was treated bad by a parent, or I witnessed my mother being treated violently, that is the expectation I have from perhaps men in my life, is that all of the men in my life will continue to maltreat me. We have difficulties sometimes taking a perspective taking, right? You see people, in your opinion, overreacting to, or the opposite, not responding to. One of the things I took my mom to the IHS clinic, and I went to pick her up, and she came outside and she was furious, and she got in the car and she turned her head to me and she said, "Do I look stupid to you?" And I said, "Of course not," because she wasn't. She was a brilliant woman. I said, "No, you don't." And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "The doctor in there was explaining my medications, explaining what was happening. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening to you. And he turns to me, full body on his little chair, and he yells, 'Are you listening to me? Do you even know what I'm saying?' And she said, and all I could say was, 'Well, yeah.'" So that was her way of communicating, right? It was her way, but he overreacted, but she overreacted also. She didn't know how to do active listening to this provider or enlisting him as an ally in her own healthcare. So we can have difficulty establishing appropriate social boundaries. Think about eras in your life or phases in your life when all of us, I think, have a story of, and so then I stopped hanging out with them because we did not necessarily have our boundaries established and they weren't appropriate. But over time, we've become better, and we learn who's safe and who's not safe. And Laura or Kimmy, jump in anytime if you think of a story or an example that would really bring the material home. So people, just wanting everyone to know that it really does impact our behavior. Again, what's the function of the behavior? If we've experienced significant trauma, we may not have realistic appraisals of danger and safety. I think of young women who are trying to cope using substances or relationships. They don't seem to be able to appraise the danger of a man sometimes, or the danger of a situation that they might put themselves in. Same thing with adolescents. It's just they're not able to really sort of say, is it really safe to go into this situation, really? It just makes a huge impact and opens them up to more traumatic events. Not able to meet long-term goals. We'll talk a little bit about the impact on cognitive, being able to stay at something to finish it, being able to study for a test, being able to go to school every day, being able to go to work every day, being able to take your meds every day, being able to manage your behavior enough to meet some long-term goals around your health or your education or your family well-being. People with a lot of trauma histories. So think about our relatives that struggle now with our trauma histories, and may engage in reckless or risk-taking behaviors. And that can look like unprotected sex. That can look like driving too fast. Teenagers are notoriously 10 feet tall and bulletproof. Or they can, again, become avoidant of any risk, isolating and staying at home. I think a lot of elder people, this is one of the ways that they cope with some of their trauma histories. And really wanting to let you know that some of the behaviors that they engage in to keep themselves safe, adolescents and adults, are brilliant and creative, but they're personally costly. And I want to tell the story of two young sisters who came to the attention of our child welfare team. And they came to the attention of child welfare simply because of truancy, right? One was 15, one was 17, and they were missing a lot of school. The 17-year-old was in danger of not graduating. The 15-year-old was in danger of not being promoted. And so after a long sort of reaching out and an investigation into what was really going on in their lives, we found out that they were living in a household with a sexual perpetrator and predator. And they were, in order to keep themselves safe, one of them would stay awake while the other one slept, or they would keep each other company and stay awake until the perpetrator went to sleep, rather than tell anybody, right? And sometimes that meant they were up till 3 or 4 in the morning. And when you're 15 and 17 and you live in a household where you have to get yourself off to school and you don't get to bed till 3 or 4, you're probably not likely to get up at 7:30 to make it into school. So their solution to not being victims was brilliant and really creative, right? But it was going to personally cost them. And so think about some of the behaviors that our relatives engage in that seem like, why, what's the deal? But that means you won't have the job anymore, or that means you won't be able to go here anymore. And it might be that they're just engaging in behaviors that keep them safe. Again, reminding us what's the function of the behavior. So I think oh, nope, I'm not done yet. We have trauma impacts emotional development, right? We have difficulty with self-regulation. We are not able to calm ourselves when we need to calm ourselves. This is particularly troublesome when we have children, because our own children can be our triggers, right? And so a dysregulated child who's tantruming cannot be helped with a dysregulated adult who's shouting and screaming, right? We have to be able to engage in self-regulation in order to help calm the other person in the room. But we see a lot of people struggling, not being able to describe what they need, what they want, what they're feeling. We always talk about children having that I'm mad, or I'm really sad, or I'm really happy or glad, but they don't have, as we grow, even adolescents and adults don't have a much more sophisticated vocabulary or knowledge around, I'm not angry, I'm frustrated, or I'm not angry, I'm afraid. I have anxiety. I don't feel competent. They just, all of the ways that we think about how to describe what's happening to us. Many of us don't have those skills. So I like to think of a lot of my older relatives that were men that were older than me, and some of the ways that they were unable to communicate unless they were communicating by yelling, right? So it really does impact us, the traumas in our, all the way into our adult years. So cognitive development. So one of the things that happens with it is that we have difficulty regulating our attention or our executive functioning. And executive functioning is this ability to plan, be planful and thoughtful, to focus our attention, to remember instructions that we've been given, and then juggle multitasking successfully, right? So what do you need to do to be really successful in school? You need to be able to plan. You need to focus your attention on the material. You need to remember the instructions that you've been given, both in the classroom and as part of homework. You need to be able to transition and have some mental agility to go from history to math to PE and back. And while you're doing it, juggling all the tasks in between of getting from room to room or getting from subject to subject. So it does impact our cognitive development. It impacts our memory. One of the things that I wish I knew way back in the day when I was working in healthcare was how much trauma impacted memory. I can remember providers coming out of diabetic clinic and saying, I've told her for like 4 weeks straight how many units for this blood sugar range, and she keeps asking. Well, if we would have known then, we have to keep repeating. Very often we have to keep repeating instructions, repeating comments that support the functioning of our relatives. So just know that they're not trying to be irritating, right? And it's not that they're not listening, it's just that they're not able to remember. It interferes with our test taking and ability to call up learned information. One of the things that I find really fascinating is that we started a lot of our work in schools, and I would train teachers, and I would say, how many of your students of your native students in this reservation school that wasn't a tribal school necessarily, but it had like 99% American Indian students, how many of them have individualized learning agreements or educational agreements that are not necessarily because of any cognitive delays, but because of their behaviors that get them blown out of the classroom, that get them blown out, out of school, where they're suspended or just suspended. So thinking about those kinds of things too. We know that 70% of juvenile justice youth in America have a diagnosable learning disability. And so thinking about the kinds of traumas that adolescents have, there is one national study that says 90% of adolescents in detention centers, 90% in detention centers in the United States have at least one traumatic event in their life, and most had 4. Okay, most had 4. Okay, where am I going? There we go. Now we go next. So trauma can obviously disrupt development, right? And we have to remember that and think about that and understand that developmental tasks are like building blocks. We lay a foundation and then we lay another something on top of that foundation. But if there's pieces missing in the foundation, we sometimes don't move on to the next developmental tasks that we're meant to move on to. So we might not necessarily go from adolescence to adulthood. We may stay in some of those adolescent ways of behaving and coping and living in the world. So we just have to remember that we build on each other, and traumatic events really do interfere with those developmental accomplishments. So again, when people endure multiple traumatic events over long periods of time, they're likely to have these multiple gaps in their development. So think of a 6th grader who has had a lot of traumatic experiences from 0 to 5, and all of the developmental learning all the colors, learning what the numbers are, learning to write his name. Maybe he's still not toileted, all those kinds of things that he missed that he can't build on to get to adulthood, right? He's down here and he needs to be here. All right, I'm going to take a pause here and ask if there's any comments or questions from anyone in the audience or from the panelists. So I see Amber Morgan has a question to somebody from Navajo. They want to get the number of participants for their monthly report for group education. So Sonia, if you could do that, that'd be awesome. All right, moving on. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Kimmy to talk about the impacts of COVID-19.
Well, I guess before we dive in, it looks like there may be another question. Oh, it went away from my screen. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. Can you recognize trauma as an adult as you look back on your child? Oh yeah, absolutely. Right? You can think about situations that you didn't handle well. That you now, and when you know better, you do better, right? That's a part of that process. Or you have traumatic memories and they continue to haunt you.
I also think that, when we're kids, sometimes things just are the way they are, right? We don't have a way to understand that that's not, that wasn't safe, right? Because it's just what we're used to or what happens. And so I think a lot of times as people, adults, they start to recognize
a much more realistic lens potentially and say, but I'm safe now, or, but I made it through this, but I learned that, I think is a big piece of healing. Laura? Kimmy?
I would agree. I would. And I know, I feel like as an adult, we make different choices. Laura mentioned earlier about, we didn't know as a child how unsafe or scary of a situation we actually could have been in. I know many times as a child, I didn't know any better. And as an adult, I look back and think there is no way in the world I would ever allow my children to be even remotely close to the situation that I was in. So a
piece of the make you resentful that it could happen to you? Does it still create the fear in you that it did when those, and then working on some coping skills to kind of sit in those emotions, right? It happened to me. It did cause fear. I'm still fearful, or it does make me resentful. I'm going to sit with that emotion, and then I'm going to move past it, right? Then I'm going to use some help to say that in a and that you can do on a Tuesday afternoon, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a process that takes, it's a commitment to the process for sure.
And Laura put in the chat the booklet that the Navajo Nation Behavioral Health Services, that if you have any need to reach out to them to access services that way, please be sure and do that.
Yes. Thank you for the comment and the question.
Okay, next slide, please. So as we take a look at what's happening in our communities today, we can't overlook the trauma we face as a result of the COVID pandemic. While I can't speak firsthand to the events that took place within your communities, I heard the words from President Nez earlier this week, and I recognized some commonalities in the trauma and grief faced within my community. I think this statement from Dr. Rodriguez Lone Bear rings true across Indian country. More than any population in the country, the shared experience of surviving a pandemic is in our blood. It's not historic, it's current for American Indians. It's our reality. We took it seriously because we had to. We absolutely had to. We as sovereigns set the tone across the country by our emergent response and the protection of our families and communities. I found in reading and in my reading and my research about the impact of COVID that's had on the tribal nations, that the Navajo Nation's approach to protecting their communities was fundamental in the development of other responses. The steps that were taken where you are were replicated and put into practice by others across the nation. Now, once again, your communities are leading the way, going one step further to address the current trauma our families and communities are facing in this moment. So again, we want to thank the offices of the First and Second Lady for allowing us the opportunity to have these educational sessions. Next slide, please. The challenges listed on the slide, like social isolation, for instance, has made a huge impact on us. We share so many things, not just within our households, but with our neighbors, our friends, our community. Being removed from the support of those we've always felt connected to has drastically impacted us all. Many of us face food insecurity, job loss, uncertainty, grief and loss, and in some cases, being sick ourselves, which is frightening in itself. The thoughts of, am I going to recover? What about my family? Will someone else get sick or worse? And will my job be there for me when I'm able to come back? All of these examples can leave us with a feeling of uncertainty, worry, and fear. Next slide, please. The previous slide listed challenges we've seen as adults. This one looks at some our youth are facing as well. I can't imagine what it feels like to be in their shoes today. My daughter went on spring break her junior year in high school and didn't return to a formal school setting until 6 months later. And that school setting didn't last long. Shortly after their return to school, 100 of the students in the high school had to be quarantined. She had enough credits to graduate early and graduated in January. Her senior year of high school was definitely not what she had pictured. She missed milestones that many of us enjoyed during high school. She missed her friends dearly, but almost weekly they were shifting from in-person to distance learning. Their entire learning environment changed drastically, and this uncertainty left some of them with anxiety and fear. Along with that, their peer relationships suffered. They lost connection with that supportive coach and the relationships they built with their teammates. Not only did the student athletes miss this, our communities miss this. The support that we give to each other comes in many ways, like when we line the streets cheering for the team during the homecoming parade, or cheering for the bus as they head out of town for the playoffs. They lost that. We lost that. That disconnection from each other affects each of us differently. Marilyn mentioned the need to feel safe and protected. Our ability to connect in a way that we were used to was taken from us. With that in mind, it's important to recognize some of these potential signs of trauma in our adults and youth. I'd like to encourage you to put some other challenges you've seen related to COVID in your community in the chat box. We need all of us working together to heal from the trauma we've endured during this pandemic. As you have the opportunity to add to the chat, I'm going to kick it back to Marilyn and she can finish it up for us.
Okay. So please feel free to enter anything in chat that you think is most challenging during this pandemic. And we're going to bring it home to some final comments and give opportunity for you guys to hopefully ask more questions. So I really want to bring this. It's very interesting to have been working in the field of trauma and trauma mitigation and restoration and healing for 15 years already. It's really difficult to collate down information to give to the general public, like what is the most important thing, what is the key message, right? And we want to make sure that we understand that one of the key messages of trauma is the child's or adult's experience of the event, not the event itself that is traumatizing necessarily. So none of us can say to anybody else, oh gosh, that happened to me. I'm fine. You'll be fine. It's all the way that we make meaning about that event. It also is whether or not, if some of us have experienced a physical abuse, like maybe we got beat up on the playground, there's a lot different toll it takes on us emotionally and psychologically and spiritually than if our dad beats us up at home, right? So really it's really looking at context and really understanding that it's how the person views the trauma. The next key message of to learning about trauma is that remembering the behavioral and emotional adaptations that children and adults make in order to survive are brilliant creative solutions, right? It's like the two sisters. It was brilliant, it was creative, but they can be personally costly. And let's think about some of the decisions some of our relatives make that seem so personally costly to them that we don't seem to understand. And what sort of creative solution was it for them to feel safe and secure again? And the last one is, if we really don't look for or acknowledge trauma in the lives of our children, our elders and ourselves, whether we're caregivers professionally or caregivers in our household, we end up chasing behaviors all the time. And we limit the possibilities for actual change, right? In child welfare, we try to sanction parents. Sometimes in primary care, we try to sanction patients. Look, you've missed 3 appointments. You can't make another appointment for 6 weeks, right? Or you're late. And the 3 lates means that you can't make an appointment. It doesn't, those are sanctioning behaviors, and that limits the possibility for change, no matter what we do to our scheduling. People with trauma histories are going to be late and they're going to miss appointments. So how do we accommodate and support each other, right? Let's look at and think about accommodating and stop chasing the behaviors of folks who have trauma. All right. I want to stay here for a second and just thank you guys and hope you guys really do think about and begin to recognize. I have a picture of one of the minions from those little yellow guys with the goggles. And I always say we should put our trauma goggles on. And I do that because you will know you're trauma informed when you look at a behavior and you are able to say, aha, something's happened. And my boss gives this example. She was at a turn light. She was going to do a left turn. Her left turn signal went green and somebody came tearing through the intersection, honking and flipping her off. And she said her immediate reaction was, I wonder what's happening. What's that behavior about? Is there an emergency? Is he, did something happen? Rather than going, what a jerk, right? So that helps us. I see it something in chat. Okay. My son was adopted at birth and was not met his birth parents. He's 3, but has a hard time transitioning from one activity to another. What are some techniques I could use to help him? So I am not an early childhood expert, but here's what I've learned learned from one of my early childhood experts. And Laura, because you're a parent of a very young one, please jump in. I do know that warning children about transitions is really important. And being able to say, okay, we're playing outside now, but in 5 minutes, we're going to go inside and have dinner. Okay, it's good. It's 2 minutes and we're going to go inside. Basically warning them and asking them to come inside. The other one is giving them choices. It's like, so you can, one of the examples was a toddler who would always seem to get triggered if you said, time to line up. He would flip out. Time to have everybody sit in circle. He would flip out. Come to realize that it was about choices for him, right? You can either sit on the floor and circle, or you can sit on the chair. What do you want to do? So giving just not a lot, like, do you want the green or the red or the blue or the purple or the orange, but just a few. So historical trauma is a phenomenon that happens to a group of people with a shared identity. So what you're probably thinking about is he has a trauma history. So it's not historical trauma, it's a trauma history. And if you go on, and I'll do it right here, www.nctsn.org. This is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. There are like hundreds of resources for anyone. There's handouts for parents. There's all kinds of resources for you to be able to think about and talk about, because they have the 0 to 3, they have the 3 to 5-year-olds, they developmental trauma. Take a look at it. It's really a comprehensive website. All right. We're going to have comments from Sonia, and then we will go to more questions.
Thank you again, Dr. Zimmerman, especially to your staff, Laura and Kimmy. Thank you for providing the information this afternoon. And one component of your presentation earlier, the impact on emotional development. One initiative of the Office of the First Lady and Second Lady is early childhood education and development. First Lady is an active member of the First Things First Regional Council. And so, we know that studies have shown that from birth to 5 years of age is a really critical time in a child's life. And it can really, certain experiences can really set the trajectory of that child's future, their path. And so our office, we really tend to have a focus on the preventative side, trying to be more proactive, taking a proactive approach instead of reactive. And so really, I know it doesn't happen right away and it's going to take time, but to really get in front of it and catch it in the preventative stages, that's what, we would really like to work towards. Again, it's not something that happens overnight, and we understand that. But another component and another outlet is really just turning back to your faith. And as Navajo people, turning back to your cultural teachings, your traditional teachings, and really leaning on that, and really going back and leaning on prayer, I guess, and really understanding that, you're not alone. I know people may tend to think that they're alone in certain situations, but as Dr. Branzer had shared, we have resources available here for the Navajo people. And then as well as at a national level, you have the hotlines, but really reaching out and really knowing what resources are available. Again, we like to share a lot of those available resources on our app and online on our website. And so that's one way you can reach out and find phone numbers or information. And so don't be afraid to reach out to those available resources. And so with that, again, I would just like to thank you all for joining us on this second segment of our Fireside Conversations. And we really hope that these conversations really can open the door for you in your families, in your home, and really see that, you know, it's something that everyone goes through. And so with that, thank you again. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Casey Family Programs and Dr. Zimmerman. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. So one last opportunity to make comments or ask questions. Savannah has a question about certification for the attendance. That is a Casey Sonia or a Melissa Sonia question, I think.
Thank you. Yes, this is Sonia. Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, there's no certificate that will be provided for attendance. If you need some kind of email or something that says you attended, I think maybe we can assist with that, but no certification or certificate.
Anyone have any last comments or questions? Now, if we were live, I'd be standing at the podium or in front of you guys, and I would be very comfortable in the silence. But it's a little different on Zoom. Number of participants, I think, oops. There are 12 attendees and 8 panelists.
It looks like Nicholas Wilson has his hand up. I'm not sure how to, Sonia or Eli, does anyone know how to?
Nicholas, do you want to unmute and ask your question or make your comment?
Nicholas, if you're able to type your question in the chat.
Okay, can you type it in the chat? We're patient, we'll wait, truly. Okay. So let's go with the Chinle region's question. I think that depends on the individual and the kinds of traumas and whether or not the traumas were for a period of time or they were chronic and over most of your developmental trajectory. So it depends on that. I think what I might be reading between the lines with the question is what happened to me, this horrible thing that happened to me when I was 8 years old. Does it really still have an impact on me when I'm 65? And the answer can be that it depends. It depends on what the event was, the meaning you made of it, and the kind of healing that you've been on since that event, and how you're remembering it. Laura or Kimmy?
Marilyn, I think you said it with it depends. It depends on sometimes I think of it as like waves of grief, so to speak, right? So times you'll feel things more, and in other times the tide will go out and it won't be something that impacts you as much as it has before. But I think a lot of that depends on kind of the work we do as ourselves and within community with others, to understand what happened, to validate our experiences and what we felt about them, and to work to do things that bring us health versus things that we might do to cope that aren't very healthy, right?
Thanks, Laura. I want to talk to Nicholas. So Nicholas, I've not heard of Viola Cordova, but I'm not sure if it makes it, if it intensifies the issue, but one of the things that we promote at the Trauma Center is always for Indigenous people to look to their Indigenous ways of healing as a part of their healing process. We never want to say, only therapy or only cognitive behavioral therapy will work, or only, seeing this, doing these kinds of yogas or tapping or, sort of new age strategies that you can use, because they do work with some people. But if that works for you, so that's why we always encourage it. We always encourage an Indigenous person to reconnect with their culture and reconnect with their community and reconnect with some of their spiritual ways in order to either to heal or to just add to the healing strategies that you might already be engaging in. Okay, I've read before Trauma Lasts 7 Generations, Could We Still Be Suffering? Well, so that is absolutely true. If you want to listen to the YouTube presentation that we did on Tuesday, that's available, that talked about historical trauma and its impacts, potential impacts today, both as individuals, families, and the community. Okay, thank you. Can individual trauma be generational? Yes. And can you explain generational trauma? I can try. Laura, help, and Kimmy, help me. What happens when I gave an example, a great exercise in at the historical trauma training. So go on YouTube and find that and watch it. But it's very much like if mom, if great grandma was at boarding school from 5 to 17 years old, and she was not raised in her cultural nurturing parenting ways, where it wasn't just her mom and dad, but it was her grandparents, and it was her aunties and uncles, and it was her elders and her entire community that looked to her well-being, and she was removed from that nurturing, wholesome, healthy way of being taken into adulthood and raised in a harsh, dramatically violent, abusive situation, as many experienced in boarding school, particularly in the earlier years. And she loses a lot of her connection to her culture, and maybe she was sexually abused, and she really just, now she has a sexualized idea as part of her identity when it comes to men. She experienced food insecurities and cold, not just physical, but emotional. When she comes back and she doesn't have, and she comes back and maybe acts in an inappropriate way, because the way we act over here to maintain our safety and security might not be the same thing we have to do in our tribal communities. And so we come back, and sometimes the children were isolated. Sometimes the families were ashamed of their behavior. Sometimes the children didn't understand and they felt cut off. So now imagine her meeting the same kind of person, a man who had the same experience that she did in boarding school, and they have children and tries to raise them, and the kinds of ways they raise them is passed on to the next generation and their generation and their generation. That's about as easy as I can explain it. Laura, do you have a much more concise, better way?
We learn through modeling, right? And so if our caregivers and the generations before them have learned to cope with things they've gone through in ways that aren't healthy, right? Substance use, maybe they've developed mental health issues and that they aren't managing. What we know about how to nurture little ones, what we know about how to interact with other people, what we know about how to manage big feelings, that's we learn through modeling. And so a lot of times intergenerational trauma is really learned ways of being in the world that at a time serve to keep someone safe, but have just morphed into something that is unhealthy and causes harm to across their family. So I would say a big thing is that we learn through modeling, and so maladaptive coping skills can be passed down because that's what we saw, and now it's what we know as we age.
Kimmy, do you want to add anything?
I don't. I think you guys did a great job of explaining.
All right. Well, it is past 3:30. Just want to end in a good way. I believe we have, Sonia, do we have Ms. Navajo here to bless us as we go our way?
Yes, she is online. Miss Navajo?
Hello, everyone again. Yeah, today I want to, well, now you can see me. That's for starters. So again, I apologize. Earlier, I was making my way back from Navajo to Window Rock. And so I'm pretty busy and I have a pretty busy schedule, but I did make time for this event here today because I felt it was very important. And just tuning in and listening to the conversation that you all have all provided here and the presentations that you have provided to us was very informative and very educational, not only for myself, but I'm sure for the audience as well. And, one thing that always was in the back of my mind throughout this whole time that you were conversating was this word that we have in Navajo. It's called hujon. And I know that a lot of you maybe have heard it before, maybe you haven't. And it's really an overall sense of well-being, a sense of harmony within oneself. And I feel like through this discussion of trauma, through this discussion of something that is so stigmatized here within Indian country and within many Native homes and communities, that it's important that we discuss that sometimes we are imbalanced, sometimes that we are, in a place to where we can't fully address these different things, but there are resources out there that can help us retain that balance again, that can help us retain that state of hujon that we have as, whether it be Navajo people, whether it be any type of Native person, or even if you're non-Native, that you're able to get back to that place. And so, going forward and looking at the overall message of what this webinar here represents, it's resiliency, it's hope, and knowing that we have a brighter future ahead of us, regardless, of the different things that we have experienced and the different events that have occurred that allowed us to experience those different things. And so I think it was very educational. And again, thank you to the Casey Family Foundation and the program. Melissa, Clyde, it's so good to see you again. I can actually see you now. And so it's great to see you. And we worked together while I was a part of the Navajo Nation Youth Advisory Council. And so our work there stemmed with the UN and during the Indigenous Peoples Forum. So it was very informative during that time we worked together. And to the National Native Children's Trauma Center, to Dr. Zimmerman, Kimmy, and Laura, thank you all for providing such informative and educational information to us today, and then for the next 2 more days to come, and yesterday as well. And so from me to you, thank you all so much, Ahiaha and Sago, for all the work that you do, and to the Navajo Nation Office of the First and Second Lady and their staff for putting this event together and collaborating with these different partners to give this information to our people in terms of what impacts trauma has on us as Native people, because it is very much different than Western society. And so it's good to address it, from a Native American standpoint with an Indigenous lens. And so thank you so much. And one thing that I would like to also point out is we talked about early childhood trauma and things of that matter. And one thing that I did learn while participating within the First Things First region was that 90% of a child's brain growth happens by the age of 5. And so those child's experiences, truly what they experience before the age of 5 affects how their brain develops and grows. And so when thinking about that and thinking of children who go through these different traumatic experiences, how that affects their brain growth and how that affects them as a person. And it just makes me reflect on my elders and reflects on their older generation, because a lot of them didn't have the resources that we have now and still don't know that they exist, some of them, and they found their own ways to cope with it. And yes, majority of it is through our ceremonies and through our prayers and our songs. And so I think that's the one thing that I would like to leave here with you, is to always remember your prayers and to your songs, and know that within each and every one of us, we have our own strong family values and ties that bring us together and make us strong, resilient people as Indigenous people and as Navajo people. So with that being said, I would like to end this webinar here in prayer, so that way we may go forward, with strength of someone and some things of the higher power to help guide us again through the next journeys of our lives. So again, thank you, and I will go ahead and end it in prayer now. Sisnajin so ziltog osli the ben sa ziltna otili ziltro odne. Kon yaha nihi yaja nitle, nihi tsui nitle, nihi nala nitle. Anilso. Nihi tijit nada hojon dole, nihi kede nada hojon dole. Nihi kiki nada hojon dole, nihi yagi na hojon dole. Nihi nagid na hojon dole, nihi zalat ha hojon dole. So rebek hojon da nitlingo. Nasko ne nijit nane katole. Nihet kayata hot etole. Nihin sekes. Nihet j. Nihet is. But zilo. Nasko ne nijit ne katole. Nihet kayata hot etole. Nasko ne katole. Nihik ebel. Nihe ma. Nihe je. Nihe masan. Nihe che. Nihe nale. Naha alchene. Nich bel inna. Adel inigi. Dear cut out. Nasko ne nijit. Zilo na de ni katole. Nihit so de na da holland dole, nihi na da holland dole. The and the neta is not ingi kodo ya nihit to da bilzen. At ishi kodo doyada tehigi, doyada shoningi, ache kunle do na jonako, ayada tehigi, doya shoningi teya, no nihik nada hojitli dole. Conti in den eda notliningi, con ni hit so de zendone he na di dole. Ben nache con ni hit trajada hot etole, conti in den eda notliningi, con yahal benia di junk di ko apaho a ko hashil so go shin ni hit the neta liningi, bit isto, bin sekes, bin edat he kitastil. A cost at the dosne donna jonako ya. Nasko be betraya da hot etones ni de never care for kake ako kodoshi ya hat ishi do akut al hasti gi do hot ishi akut al be atini digi jonko kodo steta dos list a shon de ne kodoshi ya sa na rebek e hojo na ni lingo ne kato le Kadedin at hibek echo nasko net nijit na ne kato le na dal kebe Kadedin Jonako nasko be na ne kato le Hojana hastling, Hojana hastling, Hojana hastling, Hojana hastling. Thank you all again for everything it is that you do, not only today, but every day in helping our Native American people. Ahiahat and Sago.
Thank you so much, Ms. Navajo.
Thank you. Thank
So
you, everyone. Oh,
yeah. So do we just stay on, Melissa, the panelists?
yeah, I'm going to close us off, and thank you,
Okay.
everyone, for tuning in by Zoom, and or if you are joining us by radio. We're so grateful that you could stick with us a few minutes over our time. We will resume our next series on January 12th in the new year. We will continue again at 2 to 3:30 Mountain Standard Time with the same guests and presenters that you have been seeing over these last 2 days. So thank you. And again, please download the Office of First Lady and Second Lady